The wind came down from the mountains like something with teeth. It hit Clara Reyes before she even heard it, snapping her coat open and dragging the warmth straight out of her bones. She was already on her knees in the snow, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the broken wool spoke she was using to dig. The wagon was tilted hard to one side, sunk deep into a frozen rut, and the horse that had pulled it was gone. Not dead, gone, cut loose and taken by the men who had left her here. 3 days ago, maybe 4, she had stopped counting when the food ran out. She had done everything right. She had paid up front, hired a guide from the town of Red Hollow to take her north through the ridge passes before the first heavy snow sealed them off. His name was Decker, and he had smiled the whole time he took her money. 2 other riders had come with him. They had let her ride in the wagon for 2 full days, friendly enough, pointing out landmarks, offering her dried meat at the fire each night. Then on the 3rd morning she woke to silence. No fire, no horses, no men, only a note stabbed into the dirt beside her bedroll with a hunting knife. It said nothing except that the pass was now 20 miles back and the nearest settlement 40 miles north. She had the wagon. She had a quarter sack of cornmeal, a wool blanket, and her father's old rifle with 6 rounds. She had used 2 of those rounds trying to signal for help the first day. Nothing answered except the echo bouncing back from the tree line. Now the cornmeal was gone too. She kept digging because stopping meant dying. Her fingers were past pain. She could not feel the tips of them anymore, and every time she stood to get leverage on the spoke, the wind found a new way through her coat. She had torn strips from the wagon seat to wrap around her boots 2 days ago, and they were soaked through now. Her breath came in ragged white clouds. The sky above the pines was a flat gray sheet with no sun in it anywhere, and the snow that had been threatening since morning began to fall again, slow and quiet and absolutely without mercy. She heard the axe before she saw him. It was a distant sound at first, a rhythm coming from somewhere deep in the trees to the east, steady and hard, the kind of sound that meant someone was working and not just passing through. She stood up so fast her vision went dark at the edges. She grabbed the rifle from the wagon bed and fired one of her 4 remaining rounds straight up into the gray sky. The chopping stopped. She waited. The snow fell. Her heart was loud in her throat. Then the trees moved and a man stepped out. He was large, wide across the shoulders, wearing a heavy canvas coat that had seen many winters and survived them all. He had dark hair shot through with early gray, and a beard that had not been trimmed in some time. He carried his axe loosely in one hand and stood at the tree line for a long moment, just looking at her, not moving, taking in the tilted wagon and the churned snow and the woman standing in the middle of it with a rifle in her shaking hands. His name was Elias Varro, and he had not spoken to another person in 11 weeks. He came forward without hurrying. He looked at the wagon wheel, and he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him set the axe down against the wagon and say nothing at all for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Can you walk?" She said she could. She lied. He seemed to know it. He did not ask questions. He picked up her blanket and her rifle and the sack that had held the cornmeal and tucked them under one arm. And then he looked at her boots, the ones wrapped in wagon seat strips, and he took off his own outer coat without a word and handed it to her. She tried to refuse it, and he simply held it out and waited until she took it. Then he picked up his axe and started moving east through the trees. She followed him because there was nothing else to do. The walk took close to an hour. She fell twice in the deep snow, and both times he stopped and waited without making her feel ashamed of it. The second time he offered his hand, and she took it, and he pulled her up without effort and kept moving. The trees grew thicker and then thinner, and then she smelled smoke. His cabin sat in a shallow clearing with a frozen creek running along one side of it. It was a solid structure, low and well-built, with a stone chimney pushing out a steady line of gray smoke. There was a wood pile along the east wall that was taller than the cabin roof. A small barn sat behind it, and through its open door she could see 2 horses and the shapes of other animals in the dim interior. The whole place had the quiet, deliberate look of a man who worked alone and worked hard and had no room in his life for anything unplanned. He held the cabin door open, and she went in. The heat hit her so hard she nearly sat down on the floor. There was a cast iron stove in the corner with a fire in it that had been going for hours, and the small room was warm in a way that felt almost unreal after the days she had spent outside. There was a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies along one wall, and a cot in the far corner with a folded blanket on it. Everything was plain and clean, and exactly where it needed to be. He pointed her to the chair nearest the stove and put a pot of water on. She pulled the coat tighter around her and sat down and felt the warmth begin to work its way back into her skin, which was not a comfortable process. Her fingers began to burn as the blood returned to them, and she pressed them flat against her legs to keep from making a sound. He put a tin mug of hot water, with dried herbs in it, on the table in front of her without explanation. Then he went to the shelf and came back with dried venison and a round of hard bread and set that down too. He sat across from her and said nothing while she ate. She told him her name after the second mug. He told her his. She told him what had happened with Decker and the others. His expression did not change much, but his jaw tightened once before he let it go. He said, "Decker runs out of Red Hollow." He said it like he had known the man a long time and had expected something like this sooner or later. She said she had paid him everything she had saved for 3 months to make that crossing. Elias said nothing. He got up and put wood in the stove. She asked him how far they were from the nearest town to the north. He said 14 miles in good weather and closer to 20 in current conditions because the lower trail was flooded and frozen and impassable. She asked when the snow would break. He looked at the window beside the door and said he did not know. Could be 3 days. Could be 2 weeks. She understood what that meant. She was staying here until the trail opened. She expected something in his face when he understood the same thing. Some discomfort. Some hesitation. There was none. He simply nodded, the way a man nods when he is making a practical decision, and he said she could have the cot and he would sleep near the stove. She said she would not take his bed. He said it was not a bed, it was a cot, and he had fallen asleep in that chair more times than he could count, and he was not concerned about it. That first night she lay on the cot and listened to the wind working at the roof, and thought about the fact that she was alive. It was a strange thought to have, simple and large at the same time. She had been 3 or 4 days on the end of it, and now she was warm and fed, and still breathing. She did not sleep for a long time. Elias woke before dawn the next morning. She heard him before she opened her eyes, the quiet movement of a man used to not waking anyone. The fire was already going by the time she sat up. He had oats on the stove and coffee, real coffee, the smell of it filling the cabin. He went out to the barn after breakfast, and she went with him because she was not a woman who sat still when there was work to be done. He looked at her once, surprised, and then handed her a bucket and pointed to the water trough that needed breaking and filling from a creek. She did it without complaint. They worked through the morning that way, side by side, and mostly quiet, doing what needed doing. She was not strong enough yet to do the harder work, and she knew it. But she was steady, and she paid attention, and she did not need to be shown anything twice. By the 3rd day, the dynamic between them had settled into something comfortable. He cut wood. She managed the fire and the cooking, using his supplies without waste. She was not strong enough yet for the harder work, but she was steady and she paid attention, and did not need to be shown anything twice. He had come to this valley 7 years ago. He told her one evening when she asked. He had come from a town in New Mexico that she had heard of but never visited. He said it without details, and she did not push for them. What mattered was that he was here, in this cabin, alone in the mountains, and that he had not hesitated for a single second when he found her in the snow. She told him about her own journey. She was heading north to her brother's place, a cattle operation 2 days right above the settlement of Pale Creek. Her brother Carlos had written 3 times asking her to come, and 3 times she had put it off, and then their mother had passed in the fall, and there was nothing holding her south anymore. So she had packed what she could carry, sold the rest, and hired a guide. On the 5th day, the snow stopped. Elias went out at first light and stood in the clearing for a long time looking at the sky. She watched him from the doorway. When he came back in, he said the lower trail might be passable by tomorrow if the temperature held. He said he would ride out and check the creek crossing in the afternoon. She felt something shift in her chest that she did not entirely name. He rode out after midday, and she stayed at the cabin and made use of the time, checking supplies, mending a tear in her coat, lining with a needle and thread. she found in a small tin on the shelf. She was sitting at the table when she heard his horse come back, and then the door opened and he came in with his coat dusted in snow and his face red from the cold. He said the crossing was clear enough. He said if they left at first light tomorrow, they would reach Pale Creek before dark. He said he knew the trail better than anyone, and she should not have to travel it alone again after what had happened. He said it simply, not making anything of it, like it was the obvious practical answer, and nothing more. She looked at him for a long moment. He was already pulling off his coat and hanging it by the door, already moving toward the stove to check the fire, already acting like the matter was settled. She said, all right. They left before the sun was fully up. He had packed 2 horses, both saddled, and had tied her few salvage belongings behind her saddle without being asked. The trail north was hard going for the first 2 hours, crunching through snow that had not been touched since the last storm, the trees pressing close on both sides. But Elias moved through it without hesitation, reading the land the way a man reads something he wrote himself, finding the solid ground under the white, guiding them around the places where the snow had ice or soft earth underneath. She rode close behind him and watched how he moved through the world, and thought that there were men who made a great amount of noise just being alive, and there were men like this one, who did the thing that needed doing and let it speak for itself. They stopped at midday at a rocky overhang above a frozen meadow. He had packed dried meat and a small tin of coffee, and they ate standing, not sitting, because sitting would make the cold settle in. She watched a hawk circle over the meadow below, riding the cold air in long, slow turns. She said, "Does it get lonely out here?" He thought about it for a moment, which he had come to understand was the way he did things. He did not answer until he had an answer worth giving. He said, sometimes. He said the first winter was the hardest. He said after that a man learned to find his own company useful. She said she thought she understood that. He looked at her then, a long straight look, and said he thought she probably did. They reached Pale Creek at 2 hours before sundown, riding down out of the hills onto a flat road that led into a settlement of maybe 30 buildings, a general store, a church, a livery, and a scattering of homes with smoke rising from their chimneys. She spotted the sheriff's office and told Elias she wanted to stop there first. The sheriff was a square-built man named Aldrich Pena who listened to her account of Decker and his riders with his hands folded on the desk and a look on his face that got progressively harder as she spoke. He wrote down the names. He wrote down the description of the wagon and the horse they had taken. He looked at Elias, and Elias confirmed what Clara had told him about Decker operating out of Red Hollow. And the sheriff nodded slowly and said he had been waiting for a reason to ride down that way for some time. Clara's brother Carlos was found at the livery, of all places, arguing about the price of winter feed. He was shorter than she was, broader, with the same dark eyes and the same stubborn set to his jaw. And when he saw her, he went completely still for a full second before crossing the distance between them in 3 steps and putting both arms around her. She held on for a moment longer than she intended. Elias stood back a few feet and looked at the horses, and found something interesting to study in the middle distance while the reunion sorted itself out. Carlos shook Elias's hand and asked twice how he could repay him, and Elias said twice that there was nothing to repay, and Carlos, who was a practical man, did not push a 3rd time but gave Elias a long look that said he understood the weight of what had been done regardless of whether it was being claimed. She walked Elias back to his horse when it was time for him to go. The sun was low, turning the snow along the road a pale orange. He checked the saddle girth and untied the lead rope and did the small, quiet things a man does when he is preparing to leave. She said she did not know how to properly thank him. He said she already had, which she did not fully understand until later. She said she hoped the rest of the winter was gentle to him. He said, and to you. He swung up into the saddle, and the horse turned toward the hills. She stood in the road and watched him go, this man who had stepped out of the trees with an axe in his hand and changed the whole course of things, who had handed her his coat in a snowstorm without asking anything in return, who had ridden 14 cold miles through rough trail just to see her safely through. The trees took him before the last light faded. She stood a moment longer in the quiet, her brother's voice reaching her from somewhere close behind, and she thought about the kind of luck that arrives without announcement, wearing a canvas coat and carrying an axe that shows up in the worst moment and does what is needed, and then walks back into the mountains without waiting to be thanked. She turned and walked toward her brother, and the long, wide road still ahead was clean and open and white in every direction.